So I'm delighted to be speaking to Dr. Guy Hatchard this morning. Guy, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
So I'm the creator of Matt of and principal contributor to the Hatchard report, and we have about 11,000 subscribers, and our work is reposted widely. Sometimes we have an audience as large as 200,000. I've been a lifelong advocate of food safety. I was formerly director of natural products at Genetic ID, and that's a global food safety and testing certification company now known as Food Chain ID. So we developed techniques rather to test for the presence of genetically modified organisms in food. And we provided services to bulk food trading companies like ADM, Cargill, and many others. We had labs all over the world, and we were facilitating access to export markets and increasing consumer trust. I have traveled very widely and presented findings to government and industry leaders around the world. I appeared before the New Zealand Royal Commission on Genetic Modification, and I was a key figure in discussions around the repeal of the Natural Products Bill. I've written a book, Your DNA Diet. Well, my academic background is I have a BSc Honours from the University of Sussex in the UK in logic and theoretical physics with a special focus on the scientific method. My MA thesis analysed outcomes of mastery learning in mathematics, and my PhD looked at the effect of human factors on national competitive advantage. So I published papers in peer-reviewed journals, and I was a keynote speaker at the 1996 annual conference of the British Psychological Society. I was not invited to present to the Royal Commission. I was very surprised at this because I was a participant in, especially in the middle of 2021 for about 6 months in conversations with people who were advising the government. And these included epidemiologists, people working in the SCIG committee, which was advising the government, business leaders, and I had an extensive correspondence with these people. And I think my contribution was recognized. I had an email, for example, from Professor Michael Baker, in which he said, among other things, "Thank you for that very lucid description of our current state of knowledge around COVID-19 and the uncertainties, which are large. I agree about the importance of trying to keep an open, evidence-informed debate about future options." So that was my position. And I think in this extensive correspondence, what I began to feel as the months went by, starting in about March of 2021, was that red flags were being missed. And I continued to point these out. And eventually, by the end of October, I was basically cut out of the loop because at that point there was zero tolerance for anyone who wasn't an enthusiastic vaccine advocate. And I think it's important to go through what those red flags were. And first and foremost, there was a failure to recognize the novel nature of mRNA technology. It was erroneously labeled as a vaccine, and it was in no sense a traditional vaccine. Previous trials of gene therapy had been dogged by adverse effects, which had led since about 2000 to extended pauses in any use of technology which invaded the cell and started to interfere with the genes and the genetic functions. There were animal studies, at least it's all prior to the pandemic, showing that mRNA vaccines did not stay at injection sites. The genetic material is highly mobile, and it's basically going into a system. The body operates a holistic system. It's everything is functioning as a whole. A body is not a collection of parts. It's a whole system which has a number of parts. And at the heart of that whole system are the genetics contained in the nucleus of the cell. And it's interesting to note that we have 37 trillion cells, but at the heart, the genetic material in all these cells is identical. And the body, the immune system, does everything to protect that identity, that genetic identity at the center of cells. There are, something like 70,000 DNA repairs in every cell every 24 hours to ensure that that genetic system maintains its integrity. And the immune system relies on this uniformity. And frankly, the suggestion that the genetic functions of billions of cells could be repurposed as mRNA injections would do without unintended harmful effects was risible. This could have been recognized right from the start. It was known, for example, that in cases of organ transplants, which again was putting in place foreign DNA sequences, these foreign sequences, the body always tries to reject them, which is why people who are recipients of transplants have to have immune suppressing drugs. So what we have here really is something completely novel, a so-called vaccine, which was going to repurpose the functions of billions of cells. There was, given the history of previous genetic experimentation, which had been going on for decades and was well known in the literature, and the mistakes on the part of large pharmaceutical companies, there was really a failure on the part of government to examine trial data in detail. If they had done so, they would have known that there were problems with the technology, there were high rates of adverse effects, etc. In fact, this was another red flag. Very early on, it became apparent that there were very large rates of adverse effects being reported to come, and there were deaths. And in the past, this would have resulted in a trial pause. I started to raise some of these issues and with people I was corresponding with. For example, someone on the SCIG committee, his comment on this vaccine effectiveness issue and the high rate of adverse effects, he said, and I quote, "A protective immune signature is often elusive, and vaccines are actually quite primitive in design and often don't need to be anything other than that." Now, this is certainly not what was being told to the public, that this was a primitive, novel medical intervention. And he continued, "For COVID vaccination, we are actually still in the first generation, and there will be lots of improvements." The corollary of that is that there are lots of deficiencies in what we've got at the moment. He said improvements to dosing, dose interval, boosting, and adjusting for variants. And he said, now, this is very crucial, the fact that one has to give them, that's these vaccines, to everyone to protect the few from falling victim or dying, and he's using the word dying there, admitting that people are going to die, is unlikely to ever change. I wouldn't have thought, he says. So he's sort of speculating here. He has no idea how many people are liable to be affected. And the chances, and now he dismisses other possible interventions, and the chances of other interventions having anything like the protective effect of a vaccine is remote, in my view. Now, this is an epidemiologist advising the government who's basically introducing an entirely different standard into testing of new medicines. Remember, there is no assessment of the long-term effects of this mRNA vaccine. It was a novel technology. Prior to the pandemic, if a novel technology had been introduced and some deaths, even one death, had shown up early on, immediately proximate to vaccination, the whole thing would have been paused. If there had been high rates of adverse effects, the trial would have been paused. This didn't happen. And there was words of the SCED committee member really indicate, and all the other communication, many communications I had indicated there was a huge commitment to mass vaccination, a determination that everyone was going to be vaccinated and whatever the consequences. And of course, this was very frightening to me. I also note that there were other red flags. There were warnings issued by prominent microbiologists like Dr. Robert Malone, cardiologists like Dr. Peter McCulloch, Dr. Asim Malhotra. These were very senior people, and they were ignored. So this was in the beginning. We had a number of red flags. The technology was suspect. The testing hadn't really been done. And we were going to go ahead and vaccinate the entire population. And I was, in my correspondence, I was emphasizing caution here and warning against overconfidence. And so what were our options? Well, we had a unique opportunity here in New Zealand. We did not have COVID. By and large, we had almost no COVID, and almost no other country had this situation. We had closed our borders effectively. We'd done contact tracing and isolation and so on and so forth. So we were controlling COVID. So we had a unique opportunity to look at the effects of the vaccine in the absence of confounding factors from COVID infection. So we had time. We could have waited to receive more information on overseas vaccine safety. And in fact, little of any attention was given to rationally assessing overseas vaccine safety data. When I started to raise in my correspondence some results that were coming in from overseas, this is after the vaccine program had started here but hadn't been fully rolled out. There was data coming out of Israel. There was data showing that highly vaccinated, and this is very important. I did a correlation myself between vaccine deaths, between between COVID deaths and rates of vaccine coverage by country. And there was no correlation, which means that countries that had high vaccination rates did not have low COVID deaths. And this was by country. So looking at 190 countries, and subsequently there was a paper came out that was far more detailed that looked at also in America deaths by county and so on. This should have been a huge red flag that the vaccine was not preventing deaths. And, I brought this to the attention of people who were advising the government, but it was basically pushed aside. It was ignored. There were very high rates of adverse effects in bears in the USA and being reported in other countries. And they were, these red flags were basically being dismissed as, and what was being dismissed here? High rates of red flag adverse vaccine reactions, including neurological effects, kidney damage, immune deficiency, psychological effects, cardiac issues, sudden deaths. And these were just, oh, well. reports of sudden deaths, I raised the issue of young people, teenagers and there were a few cases here in New Zealand who were dying suddenly. And the reaction of the people who were advising the government was, this must be due to something else. That was it. One person in particular who died, a young teenager, the response in my correspondence was, "Oh, that must have been done to the use of a oral contraceptive. That must have occurred because of the oral contraceptive. It couldn't have been the vaccine." So there was essentially what was happening was people were looking at traditional vaccines and saying, rightly or wrongly, there was a low rate of adverse effects and it was very limited in its scope. And we were going to see something similar here. And therefore, if something occurred outside of that paradigm, if there was some very unusual effect, if someone developed cancer or if someone had a heart attack, this couldn't have been related. So there was an assumption of safety. There were other things that were ignored. It was clear very early on that the vaccine wasn't stopping transmission of COVID infection. Well, it wasn't a vaccine then, was it? Vaccines are supposed to stop transmission. It was a medical intervention, a very unusual, novel medical intervention that wasn't really working. It was something that there had been a theory that basically the theory was really quite crude, that the vaccine material will get into a few cells near the injection site, and these would produce spike proteins, and that would trigger an immune response throughout the whole body. That was the theory. And those materials, the spike proteins, would be very quickly cleared up by the immune system. It didn't work like that because essentially because it was our own cells that were producing a toxin. And this was highly confusing for a very integrated immune system, a holistic immune system, that parts of it were fighting against itself. I mean, essentially, really, I mean, an analogous situation is, say you have a state and you start to have a huge influx of spies that are working for a foreign nation. It would be extremely confusing to work out what was going on, especially if they were all your citizens. Yeah, that was really what the nervous system faced in simple terms. The fact that there were low rates of child and adult hospitalization for COVID was also ignored. There was a suggestion that was made to me in the correspondence with the government advisors that we really needed to get children vaccinated because their supposition was that COVID was being spread by children. With no data here. It was just a sort of children will be spreading COVID everywhere, and therefore we need to get children vaccinated, even though children and young adults were barely affected by COVID. There was no need to vaccinate them. And we could have, at that point, what were our options again? We could have rolled this out for sectors of the population. We didn't. And there were other red flags. In April 2021, Pfizer issued a post-authorization report on adverse effects from COVID vaccination. It was damning. The rate of that and the scope of adverse effects was huge. And again, it was ignored. We had the data come in the middle of the year that the vaccine was causing myocarditis, swept under the carpet, basically. It wasn't until December that Ashley Bloomfield wrote to DSB saying there was a risk of myocarditis. There was no attempt to inform the public. And what I want to point out here is that In my correspondence, it was quite clear to me that people knew that there were risks. People who were on the inside of the government, who were advising the government, they knew, they had been alerted. They had received this Pfizer post-authorization report. They had been engaged in discussions with some people, at least myself, that was warning them that there were issues here. And essentially, the response was, "Oh, there's nothing we can do about that. We're just going to go ahead there. We'll get it right." In the end. And you have to realize that they were experimenting on the population. This was a mass vaccination, and it was going to become compulsory. It was going to be mandated, essentially compulsory, if you wanted to keep a job. So, yeah, but we had options that we could have taken. Even after the decision to go ahead with mass vaccination, we could have instituted, and we should have instituted, a rigorous policy of assessment of effects. In fact, the SCED committee recommended to the government that they do this, that there should be continuous monitoring and close monitoring of the effects of the program. We had this unique opportunity here in New Zealand because we had no COVID at that point. And there was and in regard of that, what was required in terms of rigorous assessment of effects? Well, there was a failure to appreciate the hierarchy of scientific evidence. That means the results of prospective studies, studies which said, we're going to do this, and before we do it, this is how we're going to assess it. So prospective studies, large population studies, comparisons between vaccinated and unvaccinated outcomes, time series analysis, longer term studies. All of these should have been given precedence in our attempts to facilitate understanding the effect of mRNA vaccines. But instead, there was a sort of desperation to cling to the incorrect notion that there were no definitive causal conclusions that could be drawn without a knowledge of the mechanism of effect of mRNA vaccines. This was a crucial scientific error. At the time and distance scales that mRNA vaccines operate, there is no window to decide what is happening. Where you couldn't look inside the human body at that time and distance scale. Minute. We are at a scale where field effects and quantum effects were at play. We're dealing with a very integrated system here, extremely holistic system with trillions of elements, but all highly coordinated. And this would be completely invisible to any in vivo researcher. And yet, there were in vitro results. There were results in test tubes, which showed, for example, that some of the genetic sequences in the vaccine could actually integrate into the DNA of liver cells. So we couldn't do it in vivo. It was being done in vitro overseas. It was being published, but it was just being pushed aside. There was a point where the whole thing became fanatical. And it was that point at the end of October where I was cut out of the loop. People didn't say anything to me. They simply stopped all communication, stopped replying to my emails. And I had to realize at that point that I had to go public with my concerns because there was no information filtering through to the public except very, very simplified ideas, safe and effective, very little reference to scientific studies here, huge reliance on the advice of pharmaceutical companies who were actually profiting from this. it was a house of cards and it began to fall apart. And so my reaction was to look very carefully at the data that was being published in New Zealand at this point. So I there was every week the government was publishing how many people had been vaccinated, and they were breaking that information down roughly by age. And so every week they would publish so many people got vaccinated at, beyond 60 and then at this age bracket and so on. And we tabulated those figures with others. There were other people also concerned at this point. So we had a weekly time series of how many people had received this COVID vaccine. At the same time, the Stats New Zealand was publishing weekly figures for mortality, all causes. So how many people had died in a week? And it's worth noting that in 2020, because we had locked down the borders, we didn't really have a flu season, and all-cause mortality had fallen below its average. And we were still in that situation from March to October 2021, where we had the lockdown, we didn't really have a flu system. But the minute we started to get the vaccination program underway, then deaths started to climb, looking pretty much like there was a flu system, a flu kind of going around, which was causing deaths to rise. So you had two series here: weekly vaccinations, weekly deaths. And I looked at them for the 60 plus, people over 60, and did a time series analysis. Well, time series analysis is a very sophisticated scientific technique to uncover the relationship between. So it's not a correlation. It's not that the two things look the same. It's asking, does one thing lead to another? So if the deaths rose, if the vaccines rose and then the deaths rose, then there's some kind of there's evidence of causal connection. If the deaths rose and then after that the vaccines rose, then there is no causal connection. Well, we found, looking at this data, that around a week, at a lag of a week, then deaths rose. So if vaccination, the numbers of people vaccinated with mRNA vaccines rose, then the week following, there was a significant jump in the deaths. It was small, but it was statistically significant. And again, that was a red flag, and that was widely discussed. It was well read on social media. It was brought to the attention of MPs, government, scientists, and so on. But again, it was ignored. And this was a huge red flag. Now, it is true that everything was rushed. The vaccine totals that were published by the government might have been roughly put together. They might not have been carefully, entirely statistically, tabulated by week. There might have been a bit of roughness in that data, but nevertheless, it was a red flag. It was a huge red flag. And subsequently, we have this whistleblower, for example, Barry Young, who has released figures which, again, he's another person who's used to dealing with data. He came to the conclusion there's a connection between deaths in the older population and vaccination. It absolutely should have paused the whole program. And we had that data in New Zealand. No other country had that data because they already had COVID. So there was always the get out of jail free card that people were using overseas, that, these deaths couldn't be due to the vaccine, they must be due to COVID. Well, we didn't have COVID, but we had this rise in deaths, and it happened in conjunction with vaccination, and it was ignored. And that, we've arrived at a point at this point towards the end of 2021, when all of the precautionary principles of the medical profession were simply thrown out the window. I had I had people I was talking to in the medical profession who were acknowledging, yeah, I can see you've got a point, Guy, if I knew them personally, or Dr. Hatchard. Um, but I'm just doing this. Everyone's doing it. They were making a lot of money. I had friends who were doctors who were making an awful lot of money out of this vaccination program, vaccinating their patients. And yet privately they were saying to me, yeah, I can see you have a point. There might be a problem here. And this was really a breakdown in the moral framework of our medical system. And the it was endemic. It was throughout the whole system. There were, you had this, the government was enforcing vaccination, and then behind the scenes, they had information which showed that they were harming the population. It was a breakdown in moral framework. We had our New Zealand Bill of Rights, which was essentially thrown on the trash. It was a really, really concerning situation. And in this situation, people with a voice, like my voice, were not only sort of cut out of the official loop, but then there was this attempt to cut us out of social media. I made for example, I made a video in 2021, which I posted on YouTube, which basically only contained government figures for what was going on and raising some questions. Within 5 days, it had 25,000 views, at which point YouTube cancelled that video and cancelled my capacity to speak. And I later learned that they were doing so in coordination with the government. This was a complete breakdown of the framework of safety which had hitherto been in place, and honesty in our medical system. And I can, only say that although it is beyond the remit of the commission, that the effects of this breakdown are still reverberating today. We have arrived at a system where an elevated rate of excess deaths is still apparent in the data. Our hospitals are under pressure, not just under pressure. In August of this year, we had the highest rate of emergency department call-outs for St. John ambulances ever. There's a whole range of statistics, number of people claiming disability benefits. There have been, as you know, there have been economic effects, but particularly in the health sector, we've seen this level of illness overwhelming our hospital system, which is indicative of effects on immunity. And this is where we come right back to the nature of the technology, which was essentially to confuse the immune system. And there are a lot of technical discussions around this in the literature, which are readily available, which are still being ignored today. I just the other day, 2 days ago, there was a huge article in the Otago Daily Times saying, why not get a COVID vaccine for Christmas? And the article said that the incidence of COVID is very, very low. But anyway, why not just go out and get another COVID vaccine? And yeah, why is this happening? It's incomprehensible.
Guy, thank you very, very much for that well, very comprehensive overview of I suppose the worst of the most obvious um, uh, ignoring and sort of deceit that many people have been subjected to. I'm curious what you think about the core job of the commission um, that it's been given, and that is to look particularly at the government's role, of course, in the whole thing. And the commission has flagged so far that it's interested in that. And we were asked when we presented, did we think that the government should be held responsible for information subsequently shown to be incorrect or damaging that was given to it by its experts, as if somehow these people are outside of government. Now, I know that you've looked in detail at an awful lot that has happened, and I have to commend your Hatchard report.com because it will stand, I think, as a very important sort of evidential archive because it is well referenced. You stick to a core area of your training and expertise, which you've mentioned here today, which is the scientific method, and the sort of obliteration of that, particularly in some of the evidence that's been promoted by government to reassure us that everything's fine, has been a particular feature, I think, of the whole thing. But what do you think, knowing a little bit about government processes, about the government's culpability, if things are acknowledged down the line to have been as harmful and known about as we contend, the evidence tells us.
This is a situation where the vast majority of the government mechanism, including the opposition and the medical system, joined hands. And you have a very difficult situation where, it's, I mean, look at the end of the Second World War. You had a situation where a whole population had been involved in uh, genocide, for example. And yet, there was a very small number of people who eventually were tried and found guilty as architects. And I don't see our government as architects of pandemic policy. I see them as people who were manipulated by other interests, which were not necessarily based in New Zealand. And I think there are shades of culpability involved for sure. And it should be the role of the Commission to recommend reforms. The provisions of the Bill of Rights should be made a constitutional principle of the government, especially. But as to saying that this was a failure of a particularly small number of people, legally, that's very difficult. I think there are things that are hidden. There are persistent rumors that the government paid out a number of families whose children had died and made them sign an NDA that they wouldn't disclose what had happened or discuss it publicly, and they received large payments. If that sort of thing happened, and it should be investigated, should have been investigated by the Commission, then that is clearly a crime. But in general, I think the whole issue of culpability, it's more of an issue of what do we do now? What can we ensure that this doesn't happen again? What kind of rights can we put in place? That's my personal. I know some people feel that that people need to be punished. I think when you look at the issue of vaccine exemptions, then there are huge issues there as well. I mean, particularly Dr. Ashley Bloomfield personally took control of the whole vaccine exemption process, and they were largely denied to people who had a history of bad reactions to medications and vaccines. And yet, 11,000 exemptions were issued to members of the medical profession who didn't want to get vaccinated for various reasons. That is clearly, indicative of the fact where people were acting in a way that was contrary to the public interest, and there is therefore a criminal element to that. I mean, these are matters that needed to be examined by the commission, and from my limited viewpoint, I'm not sure that they were or have been. I hope they have, and I hope that at this point in time, when the commission have not yet published a report, if they haven't been dealt with, this can be remediated. That's, it's all a very difficult thing because, again, we have a whole legal system where we punish people who cause deaths. And we have had a very large number of deaths. And we have to realize that COVID itself is highly likely to have come out of a biotechnology experiment. And the COVID vaccine was a mass biotechnology experiment. And so we can see here that another conclusion that should be drawn is the really risky character of biotechnology as it's formulated. And then we see the government proposing to largely deregulate biotechnology experimentation, which is foolhardy in the extreme and is going to have more serious consequences for health. We look around the world and we see institutions, universities are still doing gain of function experimentation on serious diseases. So we're seeing a sector of the scientific community that has got out of hand. It's not properly regulated. So I feel that we need far more protections from biotechnology experimentation and misrepresentation. There was a lot of misrepresentation here. The government itself obviously was subject to an enormous amount of input. There's no doubt some of it came through Five Eyes, through the intelligence systems, and some of it came directly from pharmaceutical companies making promises and claims that were completely unsubstantiated by whatever data was available. So all these are failures of a system that supposedly was going to protect public health. And we're seeing this is an order of magnitude worse than other failures that we know from history. We have failures in our food system. We have failures in the medical system, obviously, where we have high rates of medical misadventure and so on. But this is an elevated, it's an order of magnitude that means 10 times worse, at least, than anything we've experienced in these fields before. But we've seen a consistent failure to address this. And it's fortunate that we do have a model in the United States currently where there are efforts being made to address within the system how how medical outcomes are assessed, vaccination, drugs, and so on. We need that kind of system here. We don't. We need to see the whole system rolled back of advertising drugs on television and social media, etc., which are very highly misleading. We see constantly in this advertising the fooling the public directly by through headline figures of effectiveness that are misleading. And this particularly happened with the COVID vaccine when we came out to be 96% effective was the kind of headline figure that the government was presumably in recipient of from their advisors. But that didn't mean to say that it worked in 96% of cases. It just simply was that we were 96% sure that the COVID vaccine did something. And it did. And it turned out that a lot of that was actually adverse. So look, that's a long answer to it. And I know it's not a clear answer to that. And I feel that there are probably legal minds who need to look into this and take account of a broader picture here.
So I think everyone can agree that there was a very strong imperative right at the beginning of this to get everybody vaccinated, come hell or high water. And as you know, 5 years on, the government is attempting to further deregulate whatever remaining safety systems we're left with. And of course, what's happened in between, we're all arguing about, and the Commission is tasked to look at some of it, but only up until October 2022. And I think an important point that, in fact, you touched on was that all this information you're giving us, along with all our other presenters, and that you've put online and tried to get to the public, as have we at NZDSOS, is evidence. It's a very, very important archive. We've done our best, haven't we, to make it available or make it known to the decision makers who at any point could have stopped this, but in fact still continue on. And it's an interesting thought that the Commission has its hands on huge amounts of, not just this evidence, but personal testimony, proof of vaccine harms, which I think they've acknowledged, actually. They're interested in the strength of the correlation. But it seems to us, and I know that you would agree, that there's an extra criteria being added on the end of the Bradford Hill criteria, which still stand up as reliable and able to show causation rather than just correlation. There's an extra one tacked on at the end, which is that the scientific community has to agree also that it is politically expedient to acknowledge the strength of all the previous criteria when they're met. And as somebody who's trained in and values the scientific method, I like us, I think you feel personally, devastated at what's been done, not just to medicine, but the scientific community in total, and sort of the cherry picking and the worst of behavior, frankly, that's seen so many people harmed, because that's undeniable too. Dr. Hatchard, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.